What if the creature we've all feared wasn't here to harm us, but to heal us? In the summer of 1993, deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, a widowed veterinarian named Harris Boone stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist. A dying Bigfoot, frail, breathless, and reaching out with eyes that pleaded not for escape, but for mercy. Instead of running, Harris carried the creature home. That one act of compassion unlocked a secret the forest had been guarding for centuries. Not of monsters, but of protectors. Yet in the silence of the woods, something else was watching. Something human, and far more dangerous. What you're about to discover comes from Harris Boone's own hidden journal, kept in a drawer for decades and never shared. Until now. Over the next moments, you'll witness a bond stronger than blood, a war waged in quiet, and a truth that asks us to listen, not to fear. Even if you don't believe in Bigfoot, by the end, you might believe in something far more human. Empathy. Ask Mara Linden. She was there. She saw the footprints in snow, the broken cage, the coat left behind, and the promise only the forest could keep. And now, I have a question for you. Where are you watching from? How far can this story travel? From one forgotten cabin to your heart. If this story stirred something in you, send it onward. Like, subscribe, and help us build a quiet community that believes in kindness, mystery, and maybe, just maybe, Bigfoot too. From our forest to yours, with love. It was the kind of afternoon that made metal taste like memory. Somewhere south of Connor, Montana, the creek bed lay cracked and sun-blind, scattered with flat rocks gone bone-dry under weeks of stubborn heat. Cicadas droned without pause. Even the pine shadows seemed limp, reluctant to stretch. A few buzzards wheeled in the thick air above the valley, casting slow-moving ellipses over the dust, as if indecisive about death. That's what pulled Harris Boone off the road. That particular pattern. Wide arcs, slow dips, not frantic, not fresh, but close enough. His boots found the edge of the dry channel just past a bent juniper. He moved slow, knees not what they used to be, still favoring the left from an elk collision 4 years back. He didn't speak. Just let the air press in. Heat like the inside of a bell, humming in the ears. Down in the silt, beside the curled shape of a long-dead cottonwood root, something enormous lay collapsed. A ridge of shoulder under dark matted fur. A leg bent wrong. The mass of it like a fallen bull, but not. No hooves, no antlers. Just weight and stillness. He approached sideways, the way he would with a moose in rut or a wolf downed by poison. His eyes flicked to the ground around it. Details always come first. There were scalloped boot heel prints, sharp in the dry crust, walking out from the brush. A single rusted wire, twisted into a loop, lay sunlit and sharp, smeared with old grease and bits of something black. Not random, not lost, not nature. He didn't speak. Just bent, careful, and picked it up. Slipped it into his back pocket like a man collecting a question he wasn't ready to ask. The creature stirred, a breath like gravel. The huge hand twitched in the dust, fingers the length of dog leashes, curling once, then stretching toward him. Not a grasp, more like an offer, or a plea. Something wordless. The fingers didn't clutch his arm. They hovered near it. Enough to feel warmth, enough to make him stay. He knelt. Took in the face, buried halfway in muck and dried blood, the brow human-like, the skin beneath the fur pale and slack. One amber eye fluttered open, then closed again. Harris didn't flinch, didn't gasp. He'd seen calves half dead in barbed wire and stallions bleeding from the mouth. His hands knew what to do. He slid his fingers under the creature's jaw, checking pulse, then breath. Then a hand over the chest. The rhythm was there. Weak, but there. He talked like he would to a hound left out in winter. Low, even words. "It's all right, I got you now. Let's keep breathing. No radio. No one in earshot. No time for town." He didn't hesitate. That was the difference. Just the kind of quiet decision that reroutes a man's life and doesn't tell him until later. The bed of his old Ford had a blue tarp folded under rope and horse blankets. He used them all. Rolled the creature slow and steady onto the tarp like he was wrapping a child too big to carry. He grunted only once when he heaved the weight across the tailgate, then shut it with the care of someone closing a deal they hadn't told anyone about. Dust curled in the rear view as he climbed the hill road northward, wheels skipping over ruts like bones cracking. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his thigh, tapping in rhythm with the bumps. No music, no talk. Only the sound of tires and the soft, irregular breath behind him. At a ridge, he paused. Just a moment. Something in the timberline made the hairs at his collar lift. Not a sight, not a sound. Just the deep sense of being noticed. Not watched in anger, just noticed. As if the trees had held their breath. The wind sighed once, long and low. But it wasn't wind. Not exactly. He didn't turn to look, didn't break pace. Just muttered, "Almost home," and drove on. The shack was cedar-built, patched with love and lapsed chores, tucked against a fold in the valley's edge. One porch light, yellowed from age, swayed faintly on its hook as if it knew better than to draw attention. Inside, he cleared the workbench and rolled the creature onto a quilt thick with dog hair and pine needles. Rinsed the silt from its face with a jug of well water. Checked its eyes, pupils dilated but reactive. He touched the skin on its chest. Cool. Too cool. He slid the oven racks out, placed 2 wool blankets inside, and turned the knob to low. While they warmed, he used a length of surgical tubing and an old IV bag he'd kept since his last field run with the Forest Service. The drip took some time to start, the needle trembling in his fingers, but the vein held. He paused once, hands on knees, breathing through the weight of what he was doing, then reached for an old coat, brown, worn at the elbows, still holding the faint scent of rosemary and dust. It had belonged to his wife, Elise. He placed it gently over the creature's chest. The room grew smaller as night came. Pine shadows folded into corners. The stove clicked. The heartbeat steadied. Once, just past midnight, the door blew open with a bang. He stepped out, expecting wind or maybe a deer that had strayed too close. But nothing moved. The air was still. On the doorsill, 2 wet pebbles had been laid parallel. Just rocks. Smooth, dark, useless to anyone, but placed. Deliberate. He picked them up, weighed them in his hand, then slid them into the window track beside the lamp like a bookmark. Said nothing, just nodded once, to no one. Inside, the creature slept, or something close to it. It moaned once in the throat, a sound like an earthquake in a cave far away. The kind of sound that doesn't come from language, but from memory. Later, maybe 2 hours before dawn, the creature stirred again. Fever sweat soaked the coat. Its hand, wide as a dinner plate, lifted slowly and came to rest on Harris's chest. Not hard, not panicked, just firm, measured. He didn't pull back, just kept talking. "Easy now, just breathe. We're all right here. We made it through the worst of it." The hand stayed a moment, then dropped. Harris exhaled. The drip kept its rhythm. The stove ticked. The night held them both in its hush. Outside, an owl called once, and nothing answered. Somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the eyes that hadn't blinked, the valley held its breath again. Not with fear, with memory, and the man who once came 1 step late had arrived on time. But he didn't know that yet, not entirely. And the story hadn't truly begun. Not yet. The shack smelled like cedar and old varnish. with that faint undertow of something lived in too long by someone who no longer needed company. The front door had a sticky hinge that sighed when it closed. The curtains didn't match. One lamp was missing a shade. The stove ticked unevenly like it didn't trust its own pilot light. But tonight, the room was something different. Tonight, it was a ward. Harris moved slow, deliberate, his boots off so the boards wouldn't creak too much. He'd set the creature, no, the patient, on the canvas cot in the corner, the one usually reserved for injured dogs or the occasional runaway calf someone brought by in winter. Now it bowed beneath the weight of something that didn't quite fit into any story he'd ever told himself. But he worked with the steadiness of a man used to nursing things that don't speak for themselves. He rinsed more of the silt away, careful not to wake it. Skin under the mud was pale, veined, human, but not. The facial fur had dried stiff, so he soaked a cloth in warm water and dabbed around the jawline, wiping in soft circles like a man remembering how to be kind. He checked the pupils again, slow and patient, still reactive, still dimly aware. That was enough for now. He lit the oven to low and placed 2 folded blankets inside. The shack only had one working space heater, and it wheezed in the corner like a heavy smoker on his 3rd flight of stairs. Better to make do with what he knew. He found the wool coat, the brown one Elise used to wear on early market mornings, and folded it neatly across the patient's chest. The scent was still there. Rosemary, soap, wood smoke. He didn't breathe it too deeply. He stepped back and looked at the room. How small it seemed with the bulk of this being in it. Not just in size, in presence. Like a wrong note in a long-forgotten hymn that somehow made the whole song clearer. The heartbeat was stronger now, the breath less ragged. The quiet hung heavy, but it didn't feel empty. Outside, the wind shifted. A soft push against the door frame, a hollow thump that made him glance up. He moved to the door, unlatched it, stepped out with the same instinct he'd had all his life, the one that made him check on coughing horses or listen twice for a fox in the brush. The night had a wetness to it, like the creek had exhaled. Fog curled in the hollows between trees. Pine branches barely moved. And on the sill, side by side like bookends, 2 small pebbles sat, dark, smooth, wet from the mist. Nothing special about them to the eye, but they hadn't been there before. He stood for a long moment, just watching the trees. Nothing moved, not even the air. He picked up the pebbles, turned them over once, then slid them into the window track beside the lamp. Didn't say a word. No point. Some messages don't need a reply. Inside, he sat again beside the cot. The creature twitched once. A fever dream or a nerve spark. He checked the drip, adjusted the clamp. His hands moved with a kind of reverence. Not because he was afraid, but because some things deserve gentleness, even if you don't yet understand them. He kept talking, barely above a whisper, the way men do when they're trying not to wake someone but still need to say something. You're all right. You're not alone. This place, it's quiet. It's old, but it'll hold. The stove ticked again. He poured himself coffee, black and burnt, and didn't drink it. Just held the cup for the heat. Somewhere around 3 a.m., the fever kicked harder. The creature stirred, chest heaving in short bursts, a low sound in its throat that wasn't a word, but wasn't nothing either. Then a shift, slow and deliberate. That wide hand reached out, not blindly, but with purpose, and pressed flat against Harris's chest. Not hard, just enough to feel the heart behind the ribs. It stayed there, warm and steady, while Harris held still. Didn't flinch, didn't speak, just breathed through it. Eyes soft with something that hovered between fear and understanding. After a while, the hand lowered. The patient settled again. A long breath rolled through its frame, and the fever broke in beads of sweat across the brow. Near dawn, a noise came, a sound deep in the chest. Not human, not quite animal either. A vocal rumble, almost a hum, passed between them. Not loud, but full, like a kind of promise. A vow made in a language older than speech. The walls seemed to take it in. The shack, old as it was, held that sound like a keepsake, like a place that knew how to keep secrets. The light outside turned from black to gray, to the kind of blue that only shows up for 20 minutes between night and morning. Harris stood again, stretched his back, wiped the sweat from his temples with the same cloth he'd used earlier. He glanced once at the coat, now damp with fever, and didn't remove it. He stepped out again just as birds began their half-hearted pre-dawn calls. Fog hung low, no new footprints on the path, but the trees felt different. Less watching, more waiting. He didn't sleep that night. Just sat near the window, boots unlaced, eyes on the horizon, thinking not about what it was, but what it meant that it had chosen to reach out, that it had trusted, even just enough to place a hand over his chest and listen, and maybe that was the beginning of everything. Not the rescue, not the tarp or the drive or the loop of wire tucked in his pocket. Maybe it was that touch, that moment where fear didn't win, where silence made room for something else. By the time sunlight broke across the rim of the mountains, Harris had already begun boiling more water. The blankets were in the wash basin, the drip replaced, and the cot, still bowed, still quiet, held the weight of something healing. He didn't make a journal entry, didn't reach for a camera or call anyone. He didn't even write down the date. He just moved through the motions like he was learning a new way to pray. Later, when he would try to explain it to himself, he'd remember the way the door moved in the wind, the way the coat settled like it knew where it belonged, the way 2 pebbles sat on the sill with no note, no name, and more meaning than most words could carry. But for now, there was only the steady breath from the cot, the creak of the shack as it adjusted to the day, and the feeling, strange and sudden, that maybe, just maybe, the place had finally found its purpose again. And he had too, but he didn't say that out loud, not yet, because the story wasn't ready to be spoken. It was still unfolding, one breath at a time. By mid-morning, the sky over Connor had turned the color of washed denim, flat and dry, the kind that makes light feel like a suggestion instead of a promise. Dust hung loose in the air, curling behind Mara Linden's boots as she climbed the slope toward Harris Boone's cabin with a rhythm more practiced than hurried. She walked like someone who'd been on her feet since before breakfast, with a farm girl's gait. Steady hips, shoulders forward, calves streaked in dried riverbed silt. There wasn't a doubt in her that she'd be seen. The question was only when. At the gate, the wood slats leaned like tired bones, patched with twine and a bent nail that had long since forgotten its job. Mara paused there, not to knock, not to call out, but to look. The yard was still. The curtains didn't move. The truck was parked tight to the porch, streaked with creek mud that hadn't come from any trail she knew. Something had shifted in the air up here. Not danger, not yet. Just the kind of quiet that feels like a breath being held too long. She stepped through the gate anyway, boots crunching the grit, and knocked once with the back of her knuckle on the door frame, out of courtesy more than need. Harris answered like a man already regretting it. "You can't be here," he said. Mara didn't step back. "I'm not here to make trouble. You brought dust to my porch. That's trouble enough." She smiled, faint and dry. "I heard you're nursing something." Harris didn't blink. "You heard wrong." There was a pause where nothing moved. The distance between them wasn't much, but it held. She looked past his shoulder, just for a breath, enough to catch the edge of a wool blanket in the corner of the room, folded too neat for an accident. Something about the stillness inside made her voice settle into a lower gear. "I want to learn. I can work, clean, cook, haul. I know how to read a chart and find a pulse without counting out loud." "You want the field," he said. "I want the truth." He studied her the way a man studies the weather when the clouds don't match the wind. "Truth doesn't pay well. I'm not here for the money." He didn't answer, just closed the door. Not hard, not cruel, Just done. She stood there for a moment longer, then turned, walked back the way she came, no faster than before. But the dust behind her didn't rise the same way. The sky felt different too, like it had been watching. That evening, just as the sun folded into the ridge and shadows stretched long enough to tangle in the fence posts, Harris stepped out to check the latch. The gate was closed. The wind was quiet, but hanging from a nail beside the post, just above eye level, was a full-gallon jug of water. Clean, cold, no note, just a strip of burlap knotted around the handle like a ribbon. Below it, pinned beneath a smooth rock, lay a folded scrap of paper. No name, no pleasantries, just 6 words in plain, ink-stiff hand. I understand silence too, that's all. He didn't bring the water in. He didn't move the note. He left both where they were, but he saw them, and that was enough for something to shift. Inside, the patient had begun to wake in small, steady ways. One knee twitched during sleep, as if testing a road in a dream. One arm would slide off the cot and pull back again. Harris kept the drip going, adjusted for thirst, changed the compresses without speaking. But he saw the changes. The pulse held stronger. The fever stayed down. That night, while Harris read a weathered article from an old veterinary journal out loud, not because it mattered, but because voice matters in the quiet, the patient shifted again. This time the eyes opened, both. Not wide, not alert, but present, watching. The breath changed, deeper, more rhythmic. It sat up, slow, intentional, as if checking each vertebra for permission. Harris didn't move, just kept his eyes on the article, reading a paragraph about hoof rot and penicillin, and let the silence answer back. Then the creature stood. It took one step, then another. The floor groaned beneath the weight. It paused before the bookshelf where a wedding photo stood in a driftwood frame. A younger Harris beside a woman with the kind of smile that made a man look braver than he felt. Elise. Long gone, but not erased. The creature tilted its head slightly, studied the picture the way a child studies a bird too still to trust. And in that moment, Harris felt something ease inside him. Not grief exactly, not forgiveness, just a rusted place turning loose. He didn't speak. The creature didn't linger. It lay back down when its breath grew short. Harris covered it again, gently, and for the first time since the cot had been filled, he slept more than 2 hours straight. By morning, the porch was different. The loop of wire, the same one he'd pocketed in the creek bed days earlier, now stood upright on the front step, balanced on its edge like a coin. No footprint nearby, no sign of arrival or retreat. Just the metal. Still twisted, still greasy, but returned. Harris stared at it for a long time. Then he stepped back inside, poured the last of the coffee, and sat at the table without touching the mug. By mid-afternoon, he told Mara to come back. No words wasted, no apology offered. Just a message left at the filling station where she stocked shelves for a little gas money and the rare chance to read the trucker papers. She returned without asking questions. No smile, no triumph. Just a soft nod at the gate and a gallon of water already cradled in her arms. Harris opened the door without comment, and something in the rhythm of the day found a new beat. The cabin, small as it was, held them both without creaking. Mara cleaned without being asked. Found the wash basin, boiled the kettle, folded blankets tight enough to slice air. She didn't ask what lay behind the curtain across the back room. Didn't ask what had made the coat damp. She just worked. The patient stayed quiet, but watched. Its eyes followed her like a slow-moving current beneath ice, aware, cautious, unwilling to show more than necessary, but not unkind, and not afraid. Mara sang once while scrubbing the stovetop. A low, half-broken version of a hymn her mother used to hum on Sunday mornings when the cows were late to milk. Harris didn't comment, but the patient's eyes closed for the length of the song, and something in the air softened. Outside, the wind changed again, and the valley, quiet as it was, began to listen harder. Somewhere just beyond what could be seen, the timberline held its breath once more and didn't let go. Fall came in quiet, not like a storm, but like a breath slowly held. The hills above Connor turned to gold and rust in the span of a week, cottonwoods blazing against the darker firs like fire someone had left too long in the trees. Mornings came thinner, edged in frost, and the wind picked up a different kind of voice. No longer warning, just watching. It smelled of turned earth, dry leaves, wood smoke, the kind of smell that makes a man remember things he thought were buried. At the shack, the world shrank to essentials. Mara moved through it like she belonged, never asking where anything went, only noticing when it was missing. She brought rhythm with her. Water on before sunrise. Blankets boiled once a week. Drip checked, lamps trimmed. She learned by touch and silence, the way the patient seemed to prefer. She never stared, never stepped too close, never tried to finish a sentence that hadn't been started. The patient, Rowan, though the name hadn't yet passed anyone's lips, had begun to move more freely. First inside the shack, then to the porch. Always slow, always measuring, like each step was a negotiation with gravity itself. His breath came stronger now. The coughs had faded. His eyes no longer scanned the edges of things but looked into them, studying, listening. He watched the flame in the lantern as if fire were a language he almost remembered. Mara had a way of leaving things near him without handing them directly. A tin mug of water beside the porch rail. A thick woolen scarf from her father's barn folded over the arm of the rocker. A bar of lye soap placed near the basin, not for him to use, just to smell. She said little, but she sang sometimes, barely a hum, while scrubbing or boiling or sweeping pine needles out the back door. Rowan didn't speak, but he always looked up when the music began, and the shack felt warmer for it. One afternoon, she wandered up past the back shed, where the ground lifted toward the old logging trail. A stand of lodgepole pines gathered there, their trunks tall and clean like sentinels. Something caught her eye, a fresh blaze on one of the trunks, no wider than a thumb, but sharp-edged, too bright to be old. The sap glistened like candle wax. She bent down and saw the marks around it, mud ground into the duff, tread patterns too deep for boots, pebbles caught in the chevrons. Not a ranger, not a hiker, someone heavy, someone in a hurry. She didn't speak of it to Harris right away, just memorized the shape of it, the angle of the cut, the depth, the spacing between the steps. Let it sit in her chest while she cooked stew that night, while she stirred the embers down, while Harris took his place near the window, whittling bark off a cedar branch without looking like he had anything on his mind. That night, the dark came early and thick. No stars, no moon. Clouds heavy with promise. The silence deepened the way it does before the first snow, when the world stops to listen to its own breathing. Harris was almost asleep when it happened, a weight on the front step, not loud, but sure. Wood creaked under it, not the sound of an animal sniffing or pacing, something upright, measured. Mara froze where she sat. The patient rose, not fast, not alarmed, just stood. Then he walked to the door. No growl, no threat, just a shape moving forward, taking up space in a way that felt protective, not aggressive. Harris sat up. The hair on his arms lifted without wind. The door stayed shut, but what stood beyond it did not move. Rowan positioned himself between that door and the inside, not blocking, just present. There was a pause, then footsteps, crunching back down the path. Retreat. No scuffle, no cry, just someone deciding not to test what stood between them and the unknown. Rowan stayed there a moment longer, then sat down on the floor with his back to the door, arms on his knees, breathing even. No one spoke, and somehow that silence held more meaning than a dozen warnings. At first light, Harris took a walk, told Mara to stay close, said it like a suggestion, meant it like a line drawn in the dirt. He followed the ridge to the logging spur, eyes alert, boots soft in the loam. There, tucked beneath a fringe of moss-covered rock, stood a half-collapsed shed he hadn't visited in years. The door swung loose. Inside, old chains, fresher claw marks on the beam, and a glass bottle with no label but an oily film inside that caught the light wrong. He didn't touch it, just memorized what he saw. Then he pulled the USGS topo map from his coat pocket, marked the shed with a tiny cross, and folded it twice. Tucked it under the sugar canister back at the shack without a word. Mara saw him do it. Said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the lid. She remembered. That day passed without wind, without birdsong, without laughter. Mara baked cornbread. Harris sanded the porch rail smooth. Rowan stood at the edge of the yard, shoulders still, gaze fixed on the slope above the tree line. Not watching for something, listening for it. The light fell earlier. Shadows grew strange and long. That night, no one slept easily. And still, the woods said nothing back. But something out there had learned a new name for caution. And something inside that shack had learned how to stand between the door and what waits in the dark. And the wind, when it finally came again, didn't carry warning. It carried memory. The cold had changed. It wasn't just the kind that kissed the skin and whispered about fall. It had sharpened overnight, dropped its pretense, settled into the bones like it meant to stay. The first real pre-snow wind came down from the high peaks and licked the valley in thin, icy threads. Even the dogs in town barked less now, the kind of silence that builds before something snaps. At the Connor filling station, the bell above the door let out a dull clang as Virgil Bain stepped inside, shaking dust off his jacket like a man brushing off bad luck. He smelled like diesel and old leather, with eyes too quiet and a wallet too loud. He didn't buy anything, just walked up to the coffee urn, filled a paper cup halfway, and leaned his elbow on the chipped Formica counter. The clerk didn't speak. Folks had learned not to ask Baines questions unless they had the money to pay for the answer. Mara stood 2 aisles over, back to the deer jerky display, pretending to study a box of flashlight batteries. Her hands were steady. Her ears were wide open. Baines was talking low, to no one in particular, but loud enough for a seed to find soil. "Idaho buyer's still waitin'," he muttered, swishing the coffee like it might change flavor. "Ain't interested in stories. Wants proof. Told me snow's comin', and with snow comes rot. You know how fast meat turns when you can't tag it legal." The clerk didn't look up. Baines took a slow sip, watching his own reflection in the cooler glass. 1 week, then he's done. He left the coffee untouched on the counter and walked out like a man who didn't care whether he was followed. Mara waited 10 minutes before leaving. Enough time to see which way he'd gone. Enough time to be sure of what she'd heard. Back at the shack, she laid it all on the table between them. No drama, no color. Just facts and breath, and the kind of urgency that doesn't need volume. Harris listened with a hand on his jaw, thumb resting near the corner of his mouth like he might wipe something away that hadn't been said yet. She didn't ask what he wanted to do. She just waited. Harris didn't answer right away. He got up, checked the latch, poured a half cup of black coffee, even though it was cold. His shoulders were tight. His eyes didn't land anywhere too long. That night the scent arrived before the danger. It came on the wind, sharp and sweet in the wrong way, like crushed mint over roadkill. Harris was first to smell it. Then the coughing started, dry and fast, like needles in the throat. Mara staggered to the back door, her sleeve pressed to her face. Even Rowan stirred from his place near the hearth, eyes flaring wide, chest rising sharp and short. A pepper cloud, thrown or pumped or sprayed, didn't matter. It hit the door seam and flooded in like a scream with no sound. Something meant to blind, to confuse, to drive animals wild and people worse. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to hunt. Rowan was gone before the coughing stopped. Not bolting, not running, just gone. Out the back into the dark. Like water finding its old path again. When the haze cleared, only a shredded rag hung on the inside nail by the door. Oil-soaked, sticky with the same sweet, bitter stink. Mara picked it up with the edge of her coat, her mouth still burning. She held it up to the lantern light. Threadbare, smeared, and deliberate. Harris stared at it too long. His face hollowed at the edges like the heat had drained out of it. "They tracked him here," he said, the words dull and certain. They knew how to draw him out. They argued. Not loud, not cruel. Just the kind of argument that happens when people love something enough to fight for it differently. Law versus loyalty. Exposure versus protection. She spoke of hiding. He spoke of moving. She said it wasn't fair to choose. He said the world doesn't wait for fair. They didn't reach agreement. But they reached movement. By midnight, the lanterns were doused. Backpacks packed, maps folded. They stripped the room of scent, pine oil, vinegar, ash, wiped surfaces with hot water, burned the rags. The bed was left bare. No footprints near the porch. The only sign of them was the ache in the walls where voices used to live. They didn't leave through the front. Didn't take the truck. They walked the ridge path east, lantern wrapped in cloth, steps scattered like leaves behind them. The shack shrank behind them, then vanished. Just one more shadow swallowed by timber, and the night, black and wide and full of breath, closed gently behind them, like a curtain drawn over a stage not yet finished. Somewhere ahead the mountains would speak, but not yet. For now, they moved in silence, and the silence knew them. First, snow came down like a long exhale from the sky, quiet, steady, unhurried. Not a storm, not a warning. Just a white sheet laid gently across the world, like someone trying to cover what couldn't be explained. It settled over everything. Branches, deer trails, the roofline of the old shack they'd left behind. It hid what mattered and exposed what shouldn't have been there. In the clearing beyond the timber road, where an old logging spur turned in on itself like a noose, the cage waited. Square, canvas covered, bolted down into frozen ground. It looked like it had been there for years, but the frost clinging to the metal told the truth. It had been placed recently, deliberately, before the snow, before the silence, before the wind had shifted again. Harris and Mara stood at the ridge line, their breath visible, hearts hidden. She had the map in her hand, the real one, not the copy. He had the rope burns across his palms, thin as paper cuts, deep as memory. Between them was a plan they hadn't spoken out loud. Plans like this couldn't be said. They had to be lived, one motion at a time. Below them, Virgil Baines arrived with 2 men in parkas, the kind bought from a feed store or pawn shop. One of them had a dog in the truck, but it didn't bark. Too cold. Or too smart. Baines lit a cigarette with a flick of his thumb, looked around the clearing like a man inspecting a purchase, not a trap. The canvas rippled a little. Wind or movement. It was hard to tell. Harris crouched low, eyes tracking Baines's gestures. He watched the way the man moved, slow, methodical, the way someone moves who's already decided how the day will end. The other 2 followed like they'd done this before, but didn't much like it. One carried a long pole with a steel hook at the end. The other had a tranquilizer gun slung low. Both were too quiet to be confident. Then Baines saw her. Mara had stepped too far forward on the ridge. Not enough to fall, just enough to be seen. He didn't yell. He smiled. It wasn't friendly. He raised one hand, didn't wave. Just pointed. "She's here," he said, voice carrying thin across the cold. "Thought you'd come." Mara didn't move. Harris stood behind her now, not in front. His hand rested near the small of her back, not guiding, just ready. "You think this thing's worth your neck?" Baines called out. You're wrong. You don't matter to it. It don't matter to you, but you matter to me. That's leverage. And that was where he made his mistake. Because leverage only works when you understand the weight of what you're trying to lift. Harris didn't answer. He looked at Mara once, then down at the smaller cage, the one set beside the big trap. Inside it, a black bear cub paced, panicked, its breath steaming the bars. It had been bait. Nothing more. A noisemaker. A promise of pain. Harris took one step down the hill, then another. Then he cut the tie. The burlap holding the cub's door snapped with one pull. The bear shot out like a match thrown into gasoline. Snow flew. Shouts rang. One of Baines's men turned too fast, caught the wrong end of his own hook. The dog started howling. The other fired the tranquilizer into nothing but air. And then the tree line moved. It didn't roar, didn't charge, it stepped. One shape, then another. Rowan emerged from the trees without hesitation, without sound. The canvas cage loomed before him. Baines shouted something. It didn't matter. Rowan crossed the clearing like silence had muscle and memory. He didn't look at the people. He looked at the cage, then put his hands on it. Metal groaned. Snow fell. One leg of the trap twisted sideways like a kicked chair. Rowan gripped the top rail and shoved. The cage rolled. It toppled once, then again. Snow scattered. The canvas tore open just enough to show what had been inside. Ropes, chains, a steel collar, and a dark smear on the floor. Baines stumbled back. His boot caught a root buried beneath the snow, and he went down hard. One hand landed on his rifle, but Harris was faster. He tackled him sideways, both men crashing into the drift. The rope burns across Harris's palms tore open again, red against the white. A reminder of what it costs to protect something you love. Mara ran to the bear cub, now cowering near the trees. She tossed her coat over it, whispering low. The cub didn't bite, just shivered, confused and free. The two other men bolted. No gunfire, no fight, just boots in snow getting smaller. Rowan stood beside the ruined cage, shoulders rising and falling, breath like fog. He turned once toward Harris. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not language, understanding. Then Rowan walked back into the trees. No sound, no sign, no trace. Harris pulled a length of rope from Baines's truck and bound the man's wrists behind him. Tight, not cruel, just final. They left him there, half buried in the snow beside the cage he'd built, with a note pinned beneath a rock and a copy of the map folded neat in his pocket. The drug bottle was tucked beside it in a paper bag. By the time the sun slid behind the ridge, the clearing looked almost untouched, except for the marks. A cage turned sideways, a chain snapped, a footprint bigger than any man, and 3 sets of strides leading away, one to the north, 2 toward Hollow Creek, and the wind, finally at ease, blowing soft through the trees, carrying nothing but the sound of breath, the kind of breath that meant the story wasn't finished, not even close. By mid-January, the Bitterroot Valley had gone still, like a breath held too long underwater. The kind of stillness that didn't come from peace, but from the weight of something passing overhead, and not knowing whether it would stop. Snow had layered itself into silence, smothering even the idea of noise. Everything small had either burrowed deep or gone still. Mice under the floorboards, birds tucked into fir hollows. Even the wind seemed to tread lighter near the edge of Hollow Creek. Harris moved slower now, not because of fear or even age, but because his body was talking louder than it used to. A deep rib bruise from the fight on the ridge had settled into him like an old guest who wouldn't leave. Every twist, every breath reminded him how much force he'd thrown into the world on Rowan's behalf. And maybe that was all right. Maybe it meant something stuck. He didn't speak of it. Not to Mara. Not even to himself. He just favored the right side now, shifted more weight to the cane he hadn't used in years. His boots still made it out each morning to the woodpile. The axe still found the split. But the stack grew slower. More careful. Mara noticed. She didn't ask. She just carried more. Their days had found a rhythm again, though it was thinner, more fragile than before. Rowan had vanished into the white, leaving nothing behind but the shape of choice. He hadn't returned, but then again, they hadn't called. That kind of trust didn't answer whistles. It lingered in the bones of the place like smoke in the walls. On the third Sunday after the snow line standoff, the mail truck didn't make its run. Too much ice on the switchbacks near Painted Rocks. Harris walked the perimeter anyway, checked the traps he hadn't set but kept just in case. And when he came back, something was different in the air. The door latch had shifted, not broken, not forced, just moved. Inside, everything was in its place, but hanging from the coat hook, freshly brushed free of burrs and pine pitch, was the same wool coat he'd given up for gone. Elise's coat, the one he'd draped across Rowan's chest that first night, the one that had vanished into the dark when Rowan had fled into the trees. Now it hung there, like it had never left. No fanfare, no trace of snowmelt, just the coat. And beneath it, resting on the floorboard directly below, was a single bent coat hook. Not broken, not accidental, just bent enough to catch the eye, then let it go. Harris didn't touch it. Not yet. He just stood there, the heat from the stove brushing against the cold that clung to the wool. He blinked once, twice, then turned and went back outside. Said nothing. Lit the lantern on the porch, even though daylight still had some fight in it. That night, Mara didn't ask why the lamp stayed on past midnight. She didn't ask why the coat was still hanging untouched. But she noticed the way Harris looked at the hills. Not searching, just listening. Like he expected the earth to speak first. Down in Connor, the world had moved on with all the speed of people who prefer not to look too close. The arrest had gone through quiet. The outbuilding, the map corner, the bottle in the brown bag, everything tucked just cleanly enough for the deputy to say he'd done his job, and just messily enough that nobody wanted to talk about it. Baines had nothing to say when they brought him in. The dog was never found. The two men who'd run off didn't leave names, and no one in town asked. It was the kind of arrest that doesn't stick in memory. No headlines, no questions. Just dust settling over a file that never quite made it to a drawer. Mara had taken to leaving firewood stacked in two neat rows. One for use, one for comfort. She baked more than they could eat. Gave pies to the widow Dorsey down the trail. Left fresh rolls on the postman's dash with a note that just said, "Thanks for trying." Her silence had learned shape. It wasn't absence anymore. It was choice. Harris woke early one morning, just before sun broke the edge of the ridge, and found himself standing at the door again. The coat was still there. The hook was still bent. But outside, the snow was different. A set of strides, long, deliberate, unhurried, led from the edge of the tree line to the porch and then away again. Not deep, not dragged, just clean marks, heavy enough to count. He didn't follow them. He didn't need to. That afternoon, while stacking kindling near the back shed, Mara found a smooth creek stone left on the edge of the wood pile. On top of it, green against the gray, lay a thin strip of meadow grass. Bent crossways. No signature. No need. She picked it up, turned it once in her palm, then handed it to Harris without a word. He slid it into the pocket of his jacket, the old canvas one, the one with the rip in the lining, and forgot it there. Weeks later, when he reached in for a nail, he'd find it and smile without remembering why. That's how trust lived now. Not shouted, not written, just close, ordinary, unadvertised. And that evening, with the fire low and the wind curling softly around the eaves, Harris opened an old cedar box that had belonged to his wife. He placed inside it a dog-eared field notebook, one with smudged pages and water stains from a fall 2 years back. On the inside of the lid, he wrote a line in pencil. "Open only when the question is love, not curiosity." Mara read it once, said nothing. She never opened the box again. The days stretched longer after that. Not warmer, just wider. Enough space between sunrise and dusk to remember how to be still. And the shack, cedar-framed, bark-breathing, and full of stories it would never tell aloud, settled into something more than a hiding place. It became a memory made real. And somewhere in the valley, between cottonwood light and cedar shade, a vow continued without words. Because not everything wild needs to be caught. Some things just need to know where to return. And that, Harris Boone understood. In his ribs, in his hands, in the air that no longer felt empty, even when it was. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in sideways, like someone testing a door left unlocked. The snow didn't melt so much as loosen, sinking into the soil in small surrenders. Ice clung to the creek's edge a little longer than it should have, stubborn and clear. But beneath it, the water moved. That's how it started. The thaw, the return, the slow undoing of the hush winter had pressed into the valley. Down near Hollow Creek, where the alder trees held their twisted roots over black stone and deer came low to drink, the first green showed itself not with fanfare, but with quiet. A smear of moss on a stump. A single blade of grass pushing up through the melt-crushed leaves. Enough to remind Harris Boone that something lived here beyond memory. The cabin looked different now, not because it had changed, but because the people inside it had. Harris still moved a little slower, though his rib had begun to let go of its ache. The pain had dulled into something familiar. A reminder. He kept his mornings simple: coffee, wood, the stretch of light along the ridgeline. And Mara. She was part of it now. Not as a guest, not as a helper, as someone who belonged. She had a way of brushing past things that would stop other people. The old trap scars on the porch beam. The bent coat hook still left untouched. Even the faint gouge on the door frame where Rowan had once braced himself. She didn't clean those things. She let them stay. Markers of a story that didn't want polishing. They put up the sign on a Monday. No ceremony. Just 2 post holes dug deep into thaw-soft ground, and a beam of hand-planed cedar sanded smooth with Harris's old palm sander that hadn't worked right since '89. Mara painted the letters in bold black strokes. Hollow Creek Sanctuary. They didn't write underneath it what it meant. There wasn't space for that kind of truth. But they both knew. It wasn't a place. It was a promise. That spring, they opened the gate. Not to the public, not to headlines, just to kids. Small groups from the school over in Darby. A field trip here, a nature walk there. Children with notebooks and muddy boots. Curiosity worn across their faces like sunburn. One Thursday, a 5th grade class came with peanut butter sandwiches and 2 volunteers who talked too much. Mara walked them to the creek bed, past the mossy logs and the half-standing remains of an old trapping blind no one had touched in years. She let the children speak first. Let them guess which prints were elk and which were raccoon. One boy asked why the trees bent the way they did near the clearing. She didn't answer right away. She let the silence hold the space. Then said, "Sometimes a tree grows toward what it remembers." Later, when they reached the shallow bend in the creek, Harris raised a hand for quiet. Not loud, not urgent, just enough. The kids froze, giggles dropping like stones into a well. Across the water, barely visible between the alder branches, stood 2 figures, one tall, the other smaller by half, both still as stones. No one reached for a phone, no one whispered. The children didn't need to be told. The lesson was exactly this. The shape stood for only a breath, maybe 2, then turned and vanished up the hill like shadows stepping into themselves. Back at the cabin, no one spoke of it. Not right away. The next morning, Harris walked to the creek alone. The snow was mostly gone now, leaving behind the thick smell of thaw and sap. On the wide, flat stone where the children had gathered stood something new, a single strip of meadow grass, laid crosswise, green against gray. He picked it up without thinking, slid it into his jacket pocket beside the old nail and the folded corner of a map he hadn't thrown out yet. Later, he wouldn't remember which pocket it had ended up in. He wouldn't try to. That was how trust should live. Close, ordinary, unadvertised. That evening, after the children had gone and the sky had turned the color of creekstone, Harris opened the cedar box again, the one with the field notebook inside, the one Mara had never asked about, never touched. He didn't write in it. He just set a new note beside it, just a single word, ongoing. He closed the lid. No lock, no ceremony. Just enough to say this story had never wanted an ending. It only wanted to keep moving, somewhere out beyond the reach of the porch lamp. In the stretch of shadow between cedar and cottonwood, a breath moved through the trees. Not a wind, not a voice. Just something remembering how to return. The kind of breath that keeps a promise without ever speaking it out loud. And the valley, washed in thaw and memory, held still just long enough to listen. Because not every goodbye has to close a door. Some leave it open, just a little, just enough, for someone to find their way back, whenever they're ready. And Harris Boone would be here, waiting, not watching, just keeping the lamp warm. Sometimes the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones filled with noise, but the quiet ones, told in soft movements, held in the space between two breaths, or left behind in the footprints someone chose not to erase. They're not loud, they don't arrive all at once, but they linger, and over time they become a part of us in ways we don't fully understand until much later. Because some stories don't try to explain the world. They remind us how to feel it. There's a kind of truth that doesn't live in books or speeches. It lives in gesture. In the coat left behind, the water left on a nail, the grass laid crosswise on stone. It's the truth that exists in what we choose to protect without being asked. And in the silence we keep not out of fear, but out of respect. In that silence, there's dignity. And in that dignity, there's love. The kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. Maybe we don't need all the answers to what lives beyond the trees. Maybe the question itself is sacred. Maybe the point is not to prove what's out there, but to listen to the earth, to the wind, to each other. To act with compassion even when no one's watching. Especially then, because sometimes protecting a life isn't about cages or proof. It's about presence. It's about showing up again and again, even when there's nothing to gain. It's about keeping a promise no one else heard you make. About letting something go and still leaving a light on in case it ever comes back. And maybe that's the kind of legacy worth leaving behind. Not a monument, not a headline, but a place, a feeling. A story passed in whispers. A story that tells us that wonder still has a place in this world. That maybe kindness is bigger than fear, and that love, when it's quiet and steady, can change everything. Thank you for spending time with us, for listening with an open heart. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep or made you see the world just a little differently, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what stayed with you, what you'll carry forward. And if you'd like to walk with us through more stories like this, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are still so many stories waiting in the quiet. We'll keep the lamp lit, always.